start.
Thank you for your time, and good morning for the East Coast, and good afternoon for Levant. I was interested to know more about the fate of Arabs who remained within the borders of Israel after the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948. We're talking about 153,000 of them who didn't leave the country. They didn't leave their homes. Some of them managed to return back, but most of them remain scattered in the region. What happened with the Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis or Israeli Arabs? Because we have all kinds of terms for them.
Let's use Arab 48. I think it's neutral, and yet it is commonly used by that community. So we won't offend anyone, but also, but we will also avoid injecting inherent political positions. So the story of the Arab 48, which I always have to humbly begin with, I'm not an Arab. I'm a Jew. I have only started studying this community and understanding its history, its circumstances, only when I was an adult. I wasn't born into it, and frankly, I grew up in a town that you could reasonably not even encounter an Arab, maybe in a construction site, but I lived in a fairly pure, quote unquote, Jewish city of Rehovot. So in that sense, this is not this is an expertise based on studying, not lived experience. And I probably started, this is probably from our last conversation, but my fascination began not necessarily with that community, but with the idea that that community was subject to martial law. And beginning to study just last week, I met an Israeli who lives in the north and has many daily relationships with Arabs. He's not a left-winger. This is a blue-collared person who works with Arabs every day and might have, and his politics might sometimes include the idea, oh, we just need to kill them all, and at the other times he has, but he also has formed business partnerships with Arabs. So life is more complex for that person. He's an intelligent person, not a very learned one, and he had no idea that the people that he interacted with daily in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, were before 1967 under martial law. Mm-hmm. It was the classical of telling people about the military government before 1967 and having them look you with a weird face. What do you mean before 67? So he was unaware that the moshav that he lives on was exempt from military rule, and yet the villages next to him, Mizra, one of them, were not. So I was the same way at age 21, 22, when I started my bachelor degree in Middle Eastern Studies at Ben-Gurion University. And so much of what brought me into the humanities and Middle Eastern studies was my service in the IDF as an occupying soldier. And so much of that experience was is what pushed me towards understanding how we got into this mess. And when I realized that Israel, essentially, for the entire 75 years of its existence, only gave up on military government over civilian Arab population for 6 months. So I was fascinated by that. And maybe, are you familiar with Darwish's poetry?
To some extent, yes.
So,
Yeah.
and one of the most famous poems is Hawiya or Bitakat Hawiya.
Yeah.
That
The ID.
yeah, exactly. And so much of the daily, when I was in the West Bank serving, so much of the daily routine was Jibil Hawiya. Give me your ID, your ID card.
Of course.
And so that poem really resonates with that period of the military government. Maybe it was even written maybe later, but the constant ceremony of showing paper, which is what Palestinians in the West Bank suffer from all the time, especially in the early 2000s, that poem kind of exemplifies a continuation, a continuity from that period. And so this is a kind of a symbol for what I thought, oh, essentially we had the same thing. You can extend 67 to the past, and we have the same kind of regime, one with movement restrictions and so forth. Now, and you also, a very important member of that community, his name is Sabri Jiris, from the village of Fasuta in the north, who went sort of a similar route like Darwish, left Israel and became a member of the PLO, of the executive branch. He was in the research center in Beirut. So he, before he gave up on Israel, on living in Israel, he wrote a book called The Arabs in Israel that years later I found out, and I sent him to, and he's still alive. I found out that the Secret Service would not print. So this is kind of the first iteration of what I can say is my dissertation. It's written from the perspective of the present, of what it is to be an Arab in Israel, a very critical perspective, but one that it's written in Hebrew, one that expects that there is a Hebrew reader that will find these things problematic and would see some sort of political need to do something about it. So you read that book, it all kind of smacks of the same from what I knew to be military occupation 50 years later. So more than 50 years later. So a lot of the writing, whether it's academic or whether it's academic or it's more publicist or public intellectual work, a lot of it really looks at this as the prequel to the occupation, and this is what Zionism is. This is what the state of Israel does. Seems like a convenient prism to look at it, and yet, because of my fascination, I really thought that this was something that was circulating in my head. Starting to study this period, I could not get over the fact that as years progressed, this military government became less intrusive, less overbearing, and less popular by a consensus of Zionists. So even in the heydays of the two-state solution, of the Oslo period, where you could even say that there is almost a majority or at least a plurality of Israelis that are willing to share the country and end the occupation, and even at those best of times, politics was divided between those that are willing to split the land and those that aren't. By the 60s, the military government is not a wedge issue between left and right. Everyone agrees that this has to go. The only party that's kind of holding on to it is Mapai, which is sort of the center left. But the center right was already proposing ways to cancel this military government. So you can see that there's a different dynamic than the post-67 occupation, which only becomes deeper, more oppressive, and you could say that by bringing in the military, the Palestinian Authority, what you could say that it may be eased up a bit, but essentially it only added another layer of control. So I could not get over this. I could not find a good explanation for this until I came across the idea that settler colonial nations actually typically absorb the indigenous population, typically. And what was maybe anomalous in the Zionist case is the post-67 occupation. And so canceling the military government, easing its restrictions, finding it politically expedient, these are things that are typical to settler colonial societies. And so my contention is almost that up until 67, Israel operated in a very kind of linear, almost settler colonial way. 48, you get rid of most of the indigenous population. After 48, you begin to integrate those that remain, those that you could not get rid of. And I found that in several realms. This is my dissertation. The first realm was movement restrictions, which started out it was very hard to reconstruct what were the movement restrictions. Because if you have any listeners that are from the West Bank or familiar with West Bank, you know that everything is erratic and arbitrary. It's not as if there are orderly terminals and certain checkposts and areas. It's basically, if you have a patrol, the patrol can stop you and ask for papers. But from what I could tell, I had two maps that were 4 years apart. One was in the early 50s, one was in the mid 50s, and you can tell that the earlier map split the entire region of the military government to maybe 60 zones that one could not leave, and it turned into 20 zones later on, where the restriction happened. People were allowed larger areas to roam around. This isn't very benevolent of Israel. This doesn't show liberalization. It does show that it is impossible to restrain people into one village, unless you will surround every village. Yeah, it does show and you could also tell in the documentations, people were saying, Jewish people in the security apparatus were saying, we're making a fool out of ourselves with these restrictions that can't be enforced. And so the Arabs, people subject to these restrictions, are basically understanding that we are not serious. And so there were restrictions within the military government areas, and there were restrictions for leaving the military government area, and there were restrictions for entering, mainly for Jews, but also Arabs that lived in Haifa or Lid or Elid or Ramle also had restrictions going in. The Bedouins were sequestered in an area called government, but it was for some reason called the Siag, the reservation, which you could not have a more, you know, a light settler colonialism kind of flag being waved over it because of the reservations in the United States. So movement restrictions eased significantly, and you could, and I used some work by Ariel Handel, who noticed this phenomenon. He's an Israeli researcher, brilliant person, and he pointed out that there was a shift from restricting movement to allowing movement, but with supervision.
Mm.
And so from a place where they were supposed to be out of sight, really sequestered in their ghettos, then the state allowed for more integration, more freedom of movement, but that is monitored. And essentially making the state much more present in the consciousness of the people, of the Arabs. And so it's again, these are ways in order to make people subjects of a state. These are not the liberal ways, right?
Yeah.
But these are ways of making the state present in the consciousness of everyone. In the Negev, for instance, or actually in all the regions, permits to leave the military government, instead of being weekly or even daily, became yearly. So movement is rather unrestricted, but then once a year you have to go to the offices of the military government and confront the governor or the governor or his liaisons in the different districts, and the military government, and so the state is somehow present in people's lives. Another thing I noticed with movement restrictions, that it was really a way for Palestinians to, or Arab 48s, to interact with the state. So this was, I would say, the number one complaint, the number one
concern.
Yes, I mean, members of Knesset, even from the Communist Party, which were ostensibly Arab nationals to a certain extent, in as much as they weren't 100% communist, or in as much as communists can be nationalistic, and we know that they can, then that's what they were. So petitions or letters written from members of Knesset, why was this person denied a permit? Why was this permit taken from this person? All these interactions which protested military restrictions, protested the military government, but recognized the state by doing so. Recognized the state as an authority. So all these ironically, and also, again, this is not to paint a pretty picture, but the fact that changes were tangible, that the military government is not the same in 1952 as it is in 1963 towards easing of restrictions and eventual the cancellation of the military government. That creates a narrative, that creates a trajectory, that creates a political win for political. It's a tangible way in which Arab 48's lives improved, their quality of life improved. Not to say that it was ever on par with the Jews. That was never the case. But it is a win. It was a political win fought by protests and voting habits and political alliances, not by any sort of insurgent movement.
How well they were integrated in 1950s and 1960s in Israeli institutions? I'm talking about Arabs 48. What was their role in the military or at the university? What kind of job opportunities they had?
So that leads me. For the last 10 seconds, I didn't hear you. So just how well integrated from, and then it's
yeah. How well they were integrated into Israeli society in 1950s and 1960s.
So it's very hard to put a definitive description. Well, not well, but they were targeted for integration. I think what I can say definitively is that integration is continually intensifying. And I think that's what's important to say. I can't say that there was ever a point that they were completely integrated, but they were more into as days passed, they were more integrated. And I think that has significant historical importance. Now, so the first chapter is how movement restrictions were eased and basically the whole apparatus of the military government was finally canceled, and how that dynamic in itself contributed to what you can kind of very coarsely just say Israelization, or there's a term in Arabic, asala.
Yeah.
The second chapter has to do with the second chapter is on the Histadrut, which was very basically Israel's biggest labor union, but it was much more than that. It was the umbrella organization for all of labor Zionist parties, and it was even more than that. It was a major economic co-op that had companies and also medical services, and it was really a state within a state. Before 48, it was the overseer of the Haganah, which became the core structure of Tzahal, of the IDF. And what happened in the Histadrut is very interesting. I've worked on it, but there's another scholar, an Israeli scholar who worked on it and really managed to find a level of integration that is hard to think about in 2023. But it was also hard to think about in 1933 because the Histadrut before 48 was the number one, or was the bulwark of segregation between Arab and Jew. It was really the organization that made sure that there will be job openings for Jews or Hebrews only, and that fought tooth and nail to have a joint labor organization and labor solidarity between Jews and Arabs. And this is before 48. After 48, it's gradual, but from the beginning, because of the status of citizen that was endowed to the Palestinians, from the very beginning, it became clear that in this new state, where these Arabs have the right to vote, membership of Arabs in this organization will further consolidate its hegemony. Without citizenship, if they were, and you can almost have a perfect example of this after 67, where there's no drive to integrate the Palestinians of the territories who are not citizens of Israel.
Yeah.
But the Arab citizens of Israel were not allowed in the Histadrut in 48, just not allowed. But a subsidiary organization called the Palestine Labor League, I forgot the Arabic name. Ittihad Umal Palestine, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe. So that organization, which was very small and weak and was used in those small areas where Jews and Arabs had to work together, after 48 begins a frenzy of trying to get Arabs to enroll. And again, this isn't the Histadrut proper. This is a sub-organization. And as time passed on, this organization is more intimately linked with the Histadrut, and its members are see themselves more and more as part of the Histadrut. I can also tell you that that organization had some sort of precedence in uniting family members who were refugees. So if you think about, I think this is within the hundreds, but think about hundreds of people who owe the Histadrut the fact that they are not refugees. That creates a bond. And so the Histadrut was really was really, I called it the in Hebrew it's called Chod HaChanit, the tip of the spear of integrations of Arabs into Israeli society. They were like the forefront of that.
Yeah, you probably
which is
read
astounding.
You probably read the work of Michael Shalev. He wrote about
Michael who?
Shalev. He's an Israeli historian who wrote about the Jewish organized labor and the Palestinians. He's talking about the same subject, how they were integrated into Histadrut and other Israeli organizations, because after 48 they became part of the new state, regardless of their family ties with Arabs in Jordan or Arabs in the West Bank or Gaza Strip or Lebanon. This is a different point.
And I can tell you that the type of historian that I am, I went to the files of the Histadrut, and I was really interested in kind of the daily routine of the Histadrut in the Arab sector, in Arab villages and towns. And what you see is in the monthly reports, which might be exaggerated to a certain extent. So the local Arab representative says we had 3 lectures. I went to the employer of this and that and told them that he can't employ like this or he needs to pay sick days. I arranged for I don't know. I arranged for a soccer game to take place, and surrounding 56, the massacre in Kfar Kasem. So Histadrut local operatives took the role of compensating and treating the families of those that were murdered. So they were the ones that they did the paperwork for getting compensation from the state. They made sure that they find some sort of employment that's more comfortable, right? This isn't exercise in liberal democracy. Big bureaucratic organizations, people put aside grand political ideas and really, and this kind of daily interaction with one of Zionism's most important establishments makes that establishment legitimate and almost transparent and as a matter of fact. So and interestingly enough, this is again more symbolic than empiric, but this organization that was dedicated to the segregations of Arabs and Jews and really creating a higher quality of life, kind of like the separation between blacks and whites in South Africa before 48, after 48, and then in 66, the year that the military government is canceled, it changes its name. It erases the word Hebrew, from the long form name, and it becomes Histadrut HaOvdim B'Israel, the labor organization of Israel, not the Hebrew labor. It changes the name specifically to accommodate the Arabs. And there's something I notice about that change, which need not have been done, by the way, because, for instance, I mean, it was probably the way to go if you wanted to make the Arab members feel more part of it. But I've encountered, for instance, a letter in 1952 that is a letter written in Hebrew in amazing handwriting by a Christian Arab who says, I don't understand why I cannot be a member of the Histadrut, because at the time they weren't allowed. They were just in that subsidiary. I am a Hebrew. I speak Hebrew. So the term Hebrew wasn't Jewish. The term Hebrew it had the potential. It never became, but it had the potential to become inclusive of non-Jews because it's a language.
Of course.
That didn't happen. Hebrew was deleted instead of trying to integrate Arabs as Hebrews, but you could tell that was possible, or maybe a possibility. And I had one last anecdote about and another thing that's important is that I saw, for instance, in reports about events of the Palestine Labor League, which became the Israel Labor League in the 1950s, early 1950s. You see reports in their meetings or cultural events that there is clear criticism. And their newspaper. They published a newspaper, El Yawm, a daily Arab newspaper. In those venues, there was rather open criticism of the policies of the government and of the military government. And so this was definitely a venue where Arab citizens or Arab 48s exercise their political rights. So I see that we only don't have much time remaining.
Yeah, I'm going to send you another link in a few minutes.
Okay.
I don't want you to get cut in the middle of your speech. So
Okay.
I'll send you the link in a few minutes.
Okay.
Now we're talking about chapter 3 of your
Yeah. So
dissertation.
chapter three is very much related to the Histadrut, but it is a subset of it. It has to do with health services. And this is a realm in which you could really see there's something about health services which seems to make people, as a service that the state gives to its citizens, there's something about health which I think is unique because it's life and death, right? If and so I was very interested in the penetration of Zionist health organizations into Arab communities.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the numbers, child mortality, life expectancy, I'm at the time I probably looked at whatever was available. You obviously see the Arabs are behind the Jews. And to be honest, I'm not sure that things improved on a tremendous level. But in the realm of at least access, that changed during the 50s and then the 60s. And you could really tell, so as best as I could, I didn't have any kind of put together almanac of clinics that the Histadrut was the main, and still is, by the way, the main purveyor of health services. But I could, I gathered from newspaper clippings and different reports where clinics were formed. And you could really tell that things got better. In the early years, services for Arab citizens were given directly by the Ministry of Health, which was not how most Jewish citizens got their health services. Jewish citizens got it from these health co-ops, the biggest one run by the Histadrut, but others run by other co-ops. And you could tell that the Israeli services were not adequate. The idea of having a kind of almost, it really was almost like a Dr. Quinn medicine woman. It was like this one service, this one doctor who would have a truck with some medical aid, and he would open a clinic in different, and it was sporadic. And the doctor that did it, usually, not always, was not very committed. The doctor that ended up in the Negev was actually very committed. And I interviewed, he was an immigrant or ole. I think ole is always the best word. Like it's the Hebrew word for coming to Israel. He was an ole from Holland.
Yeah.
Who was had a true doctor obligation as a doctor,
of course,
humanist, of
course.
And he treated the Bedouins, but there was also I interviewed his wife, and she had a very interesting. They were of course always welcomed at one of the sheikhs' tents, and they
Yeah.
would be treated to coffee. And she remembers this one time where the sheikh and the doctor were sitting, and we're looking at the view, and he said, the doctor said, "This is wonderful. What could you ever more want in life?" And the sheikh said, I prefer having your apartment in Beersheba. You can have this tent." And so it was also, so it was a relationship, a very open relationship. This isn't a romanticized Orientalist encounter, right? This is really human beings meeting other human beings on eye level and treating illnesses, which is what this doctor did. So as time passed on, the medical services became more routine, more managed more similarly like they were on the Jewish sector. Again, probably not at the same levels. In the 1950s, there was a measles outbreak in the Galilee that affected primarily Druze villages.
Mhm.
And I recall that there was quite a bit of reporting in the newspapers about this. And remember, this is at a time, this was really around, probably before the Druze were conscripted into the military as part of the draft. So I think like Druze and regular Arabs, I think were the same at the time, but there was some concern. And also, interest is also a part of this. There was no such thing as the Arab health full stop, because infectious diseases, especially, things like polio and other diseases that are mostly treatable with vaccines, highly contagious. And so if one segment of the population has it, then it could reach the people you quote unquote care about. So for many reasons, health services improved. And from the point of view of the Histadrut, this was probably the most popular service they offered its members. And one thing I noticed is that demand for health services was, again, a way to integrate into the state. So by making claims as a citizen of the country, sometimes, so in a way, the dynamic is that discrimination is a way to fighting discrimination, is a method or is a venue or a path of integration. When you are fighting discrimination in the name not of some sort of national ethos, but of a civilian one, as Israeli citizens, we deserve this, this, and that, that makes the state present in your political horizon. And again, so but also, and this is why this is a bit different from the other. There's also something very human and existential about health services and about people administering health services. And I have a letter from one of the kind of traveling doctors in the earlier periods, really berating, she was Jewish, really berating the health ministry of not putting enough resources into medical access for Palestinian Arabs. And I think it was definitely a realm in which I think today it has gone maybe a full circle, where there's almost a majority, if not definitely a majority, of Arab medical service people in Israel, doctors and nurses, definitely in pharmacy, where if you are trying to avoid Arabs, don't get sick in Israel. It's that simple, and that does something. I wouldn't want to romanticize it, and again say that there are the hospitals is where coexistence happens to a perfect degree, but it's definitely something. These are places where people put aside their politics and sometimes their ethno-national preferences. Sometimes they don't. Smotrich, the minister, famously said how
finance minister.
Yeah, finance minister. He has power within the Ministry of Defense. So this guy famously said that he prefers not to have an Arab an Arab labor woman in labor or new who just given birth next to his wife, something like that. And it's a Jewish moment. Horrible racism that very much befits the mentality of settlers in the West Bank. Not what I have seen from the first 2 decades, where every Arab under Israeli control had at least citizenship.
Yeah.
So one anecdote from that episode that I liked is that a clinic was opened in one of the Arab villages, and they brought a histadrut, and they brought a one of the heads of the histadrut, if not the head, but probably not the head, to give a speech. And the whole speech about opening that clinic was about the place of Arabs in Israeli and Zionist society. It was a bit patronizing, but also inclusive. Like, this is how you become citizens, and this is what you deserve, and this will strengthen the ties, and so on. And then I saw a report about someone smearing with cow shit the Israeli flag that was placed on that clinic. So to me, I mean, it's definitely a sign that some Arabs were not very appreciative, or it shows the latent dissatisfaction with the state, obviously. But it also shows that these clinics and using their services was, the moment you enter into the doors of these clinics, and it's very cynical. It's again not very. I'm not trying to paint a utopian vision, but that means that if you entered, if there was such emphasis put on the symbolics of a clinic, right? The histadrut saying this is how we make you citizens of the country. Someone smears with cow shit the flag, showing no, we do not identify with you, right? If this is the symbolism surrounding the clinic, it's not just a clinic, right? Then everyone who chose to use those services, everyone who entered those doors, basically knew that, or could somehow experience, yes, I am submitting to the state. And this is how I think Foucault talked about it. I'm not a huge proponent of using Foucault Michel Foucault on everything.
Yeah.
But there is something about the state really entering the fibers of your being. And I think this is the dynamic that you see. It's not necessarily, modernity, and for any human being to have a sense of patriotism towards their state is kind of unnatural, right?
Yeah.
So this is not a different case, except that there is a national conflict that hasn't ended, and after 67 even gets worse.
How these two communities interact? Is it possible for an Israeli Jew, regardless of his ethnic background, because we know that Jews are pretty heterogeneous themselves, how they integrate with Arabs? Can they marry? Can they divorce? Or we have two separated communities?
Now you're talking of it's a high level of separation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a high level of separation. I would say that minus the national conflict,
yeah,
it is akin to African Americans in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The rate of intermarriage is much, much lower.
Of course.
It's in single-digit percentages.
Yeah.
And yet, even after the year 2000, so after 67, if you remember from the last session, I said Israel suddenly, within Israeli borders, there was a de facto non-citizen population, which the dynamic between that population and the state took a different trajectory. But because it took a different trajectory, and because there are organic ties between Arabs, between the two sides of the Green Line, then it kind of muddied the water, right? If there was some sort of path that Palestinians were headed to, the fact that another population is added to the country's population control roster, that changes that trajectory, that changes how integration happens. It doesn't entirely affect it in a negative way. I know for a fact that a certain sense of condescension came from Arab 48s towards Duffy and people from the sense that now a new population is at the lower tiers of society, and so that somehow elevates the Arabs in Israel. But if you have conflict, the organic solidarity of Arabs in Israel with people in the territories makes them immediately suspect of being unloyal, and the fact that they share languages and cultures, that has made integration rockier.
Yeah.
But it has also gave birth to the kind of Smotrich type of racism.
Of course.
But things continue. I mean, Asala, the Israelization, carried on after 67.
Yeah.
And there's a TV personality. Her name is Lucy Aharish, whose life circumstances led her to grow up in Dimona.
Yeah.
The city, not the nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
And this is the very, very periphery of Jewish society. But it was enough to make her almost a Zionist. And so she has appeared in several more mainstream, probably and more to the left. She married a Jew. And these people, they're prominent. And so, again, the the ongoing and intensification of the conflict with the Palestinians in the territories didn't help, but it did not put an end to integration. And you even see this with Nas Daily. Do you know this guy?
No, I don't know him.
So he's a vlogger, right? He's almost a YouTuber. He doesn't use YouTube.
I normally don't follow YouTubers.
He's an Arab 48er.
Okay.
He's an Arab 48er who grew up in Arabic. Very modest. I mean, his parents were somehow in government jobs, so maybe that explains something. But again, not high level government jobs, right? And he went to Harvard, and so you could imagine that he had all the reasons in the world to integrate into American society as a Palestinian who is oppressed and by Zionism and global imperial forces, right? But no, and every time he delves into politics in his videos, and he's not very astute, and he's not very sharp, and I don't find him to be very sophisticated. But he's always, I'm Palestinian and I'm Israeli. He's kind of, he's this kind of.
Listen, usually bloggers are not very sharp. I'm not going to generalize, but bloggers and vloggers are producing material for general public. So to expect from them to be very sophisticated is wrong. Okay, maybe some of them are very sophisticated, but in general, you can't expect from bloggers to be very sharp.
And he's not, but it's not even. You can be very unsophisticated and yet very committed nationally to the Palestinian cause, for instance.
Yeah, you can. You can be crude.
I think this is a lot of what we're seeing now in the United States now. Solidarity with the Palestinians performed in a very unsophisticated way. Just yesterday, I saw graffiti over a World War II cemetery, Free Palestine. I don't understand why these people are trying to help the Israeli cause by doing that. But in any case, Nas Daily is an example. Most Arab 48ers who find their way to the United States and have large intellectual or more educated audiences, most of them become fully fledged Palestinians, pro-Muqawama.
They became activists.
But he's not, for instance, and many others not. And there's so much in between. Do we have time to go over the last chapter of my dissertation?
Yeah, we can in this segment.
Yeah. So the last episode really has to do, partially with education, another service that the government gives, and also with this is where I'm at my most tentative and cautious, because this has to do with the state of, what is the emotional identification with the state of Israel, which is something I will never really understand. It's something I can never put in words and I can never attest to. Because I always say, as an Ashkenazi Jew, this state was created for me.
Of course.
For me, my identification with the state is really it's almost I don't have to reflect about it. Right?
But can you identify, for instance, with Poland, for instance? You told me that your family came from Poland. Yeah.
No, not to the least bit.
Yeah.
But it's like identifying with Mars for me.
Yeah. Although some people have this type of dual identity. You can find that.
I've seen that. You see with American Jews and Israelis that live here. I'm right now in the United States.
No, some of them have multiple identities.
Right. But it's more complicated for the Arabs. And so, like, one anecdote that I used in that is that I spoken to a principal from the village of Jaljulia.
Yeah.
His name was Mustafa Muwal. Someone who was lost his leg in 48. for being an incompetent fighter, not because he was very brave. But he was probably the most educated person in his village, from Jajuria, a very small village, and he was given the chance to be in the teacher's seminary in Jaffa that was opened. So the country invested modest sums in training Arab teachers, partially for utilitarian reasons. You'd want to have some sort of sway over the educated class, but also the mandatory education law was placed over Arabs as well. And you could tell that there were functionaries in the Ministry of Education that really, they had a job. Their job was to put Arabs in classrooms.
Yeah.
Maybe if they reflected on it, they had a way of understanding how this fulfills a Zionist mission and so on and so forth, or maybe a humanist mission. But most of the time, they're not reflecting. They have a job to do. So you see you see investment in getting Arabs into state-run classrooms on a national scale, on a scale that the mandate never did. The mandate government was very happy with the private schools, the Christian, mostly Christian institutions. Israel didn't let go of that. Israel was occasionally very happy to have private endowments, Christian endowments, take care of education, but it also behaved like a state. And that principal, for instance, had a very tricky relationship because he was automatically suspect as someone who's got his salary from the government. He was automatically suspect in collaboration, and he was open. He was open with me. He said that he would have conversations with someone from the Mukhabarat, from
the service, from the political
service, and he of course denied being a collaborator, right? But it seemed to me that it was obvious to him that he had to say certain things, right? I don't know, or this guy is okay, that this is something that he had to live with. And he also knew that, that if he ever developed a very oppositionary stance, then his future as a principal would not be guaranteed.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that's but and according with that, Arab teachers were usually not hired into the same conditions as Jewish teachers, not in terms of salary. And by the way, the Histadrut fought for that also, eventually. Not in terms of salary, not in terms of tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this habit of trying to get Arab teachers to teach far from their home. I don't know if it was some sort of colonial thinking that you don't want to create, like, divide and conquer or something like that. But also, contracts were not renewed. Mass firings would take place. An Arab teacher knew that they had to. I would not be surprised if every other Arab teacher was actually reporting to the services.
Mm.
And yet, throughout in the documentation, you see expressions of criticism towards the state, expressions of hatred towards the state, support for Nasser, disobedience, and you see the state not like one character at one time in the 50s comes up as being someone that you have to get rid of him. He cannot be a teacher. And then in the 60s, I see him as a principal.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you could see that the state did not put its entire weight on the Arab teachers. Suspicions were always raised. A sense of being monitored was always there. But you could tell, I mean, one time I saw this correspondence with the legal advisor of the Ministry of Education saying, look, we have this student who ripped the picture of Herzl, right? In defiance. We don't have the legal infrastructure to
punish
expel him from school. No, so he can be punished, but we can't say he cannot attend school. There's just, the law isn't there.
Okay, so he can go from one school to another. Can be transferred.
And so there's something about the mechanisms of a state, one that is nominally democratic, that has a bureaucracy and has a certain type of rule of law, which prevents the over repression of suspect communities. And it also, and I could see amongst the highest levels of functionaries in the Arab sector of the the Office of Education, Ministry of Education, you could tell an awareness that the Arab citizens are not Zionists.
Most of them are not, definitely.
But sometimes you have to look the other way. And one shouldn't force upon the Arabs celebrating Independence Day, all these things. And yet, if it happens, we should welcome it. A willingness to live in a gray area, I think, is something that was invited Arab 48ers to also live in a gray area when it comes to the state. So one could hold within his heart feelings of resentment, bitter memories, experiences of discrimination, and yet realizing that the framework of the state of Israel and its institutions, medical, education, welfare, is something you can work with in order to better your life.
Okay.
There was room for that. And so Mustafa Murad, who in his memoirs, that were published in the 2000s, really says about how he felt uncomfortable during Independence Day and how Arab teachers thought that they were expected to create these lavish pageants. Told me that I asked him in a cafe, when people, I showed him a police report about Arabs sitting in a cafe, and suddenly Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, appears on the TV.
On the TV.
And everyone goes, Yaish, and they were very, very excited.
Of course. You're talking about 1960s.
And I asked him, who were, and Nasser at the time is Sinwar and Khamenei and Nasrallah put into one for Israel.
Yeah, he was demonized at that time, of course.
And I asked him, who were the people that were excited about Nasser? And he smiled and he said, everyone.
Of course.
And so Israel, in that time period, was much more tolerant to this ambivalence.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for the end, I'm just going to say that in 1950s and 60s, Israel was led by socialist Zionists that have a totally different ideology and different approach, more or less. Now, some people will criticize what he just said, but socialist Zionists had different approach than Likud and later on Kahanists.
But interestingly enough, Stefan, the Likud, the Menachem Begin was against the military government way before Mapai was.
That's interesting.
So a true socialist ideology and a true liberal ideology, they both have the ability to transcend national differences or ethnic differences. Let's just say that.
Yeah, we can say ethnic differences because they're both citizens of Israel.
Yeah, and since we're really running out of time, and maybe this is how we could start. Keep in mind, 1969, the Likud's platform for what to do with the territories is annexation and a path to citizenship.
Yeah. Okay,
this
we
is
can talk
the
about
opposite. This is different than the socialists program, than Avodah, labor, which was partial economic integration and keeping the territories as a negotiating as a
negotiating chip. Yeah.
But it's also opposite from Kahana.
No, Kahana, of course. Not only Kahana, you have now the whole spectrum of leaders in opposition and the government who support transfer and ethnic cleansing, and probably expansion to other territories, including East Bank and Lebanon.
And Menachem Begin was pro citizenship.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? I mean, at the very least, you know very well that the status of the Kutsis from Eastern Jerusalem is so much different than the rest of the West Bank.
True.
And that's even without citizenship.
True.
Just residency.
They have residency and they're not full citizens of Israel.
Has created a very distinct situation amongst this population. Can you imagine what would have? But alas, Menachem Begin won 22 mandates, and the Labor Party got 50 something.
Yeah.
So, but it goes to show you that within the heart of Zionism, there was an understanding that Zionism could be that Jewish-Arab equality within a Zionist framework is beneficial to Zionism.
On the long run, yes. And we can stop here because now we're running out of time. We can continue with that because this is an interesting topic. Sorry for cutting this off, but I have to rush.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care. Take care. Thank
Bye.
you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye. All the best.